admission and access to these museums and these stories and our educational resources, as well as funding for transportation and lunch. And so if you are not a member yet of the two Mississippi museums, I'd highly encourage you to go online and become a member, or you can go to our front desk and become a member today. But those memberships help support that education program to ensure that our Mississippi students from across the state have access to these stories, many of the stories that we'll hear today from our speaker. And so with that said, I want to invite up our education and research manager, Jasmine Holmes, who's going to introduce our speaker for today.
Hello. How are y'all? Good. All right, today we're delighted to welcome Omo Moses to present The White Peril, a family memoir, a powerful story that weaves the writings of his father, Bob Moses, and his great-grandfather's sermons with his own life experiences. Moses is the founder and CEO of Math Talk, an education technology company that creates products that inspire adults and kids everywhere, particularly those in economically distressed areas, to enjoy math. Moses is a member of the MSNBC Griot 100, a Huffington Post Person of the Day, and a Barr Foundation Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Omo Moses.
Thank you. They got this, so you can hear me. All right. I don't need a mic. They got me double mic'd, so I don't know. Oh, how's everyone doing? Good. Well, about 24 hours ago, this room was filled with young people from second grade to 12th grade from different parts of Mississippi. And I had a remarkable opportunity just to talk to them about a little bit about my story, my dad's story, my great-grandfather's story, but more about, their stories and their experiences. And so they were super talkative. They had a lot to say, and so I hope you guys don't interrupt me while I'm speaking, but afterwards we're going to have a conversation with Mr. Figures and Albert, and we hope you all have a lot of questions, and this can be more of a conversation. And so I've been working on a book for 30 years. It's a long time. I started writing really in my high school creative writing class. So I was probably in about 11th grade. And that was really a remarkable experience because I probably said about 10 words throughout the previous 2 or 3 years at high school. But for whatever reason, this teacher created a space for me to find my voice. And my voice returned me to Africa, to Tanzania, where I was born. And all these memories that I had that were buried in Tanzania just came out. And so The White Peril, first of all, The White Peril gets its name from a book that my great-grandfather wrote, which Mr. Figures introduced me to in 1919. And so I discovered this book in Mississippi. And Dave Dennis and Uncle Dave, he's always going to outdo me, and so he got the hardcover version of this. I don't know how much he paid for it, but he got it bounded, and it looks fresh. Mine is like over 100 years old, But Dave, thank you for coming through. One of my dad's best friends, a comrade. Someone that struggled with him in the movement and worked with him through the Algebra Project and is continuing the work. And I feel blessed to have been able to spend time with Dave and tasting his gumbo or whatever you wanted to call it, and to be able to sit at his footsteps, And so, I sat at Dave's footsteps, I sat at Mr. Figures' footsteps, and the lessons that I learned and the experiences that I had are just invaluable. And so with this book, I try to bring all that stuff into the book. And so I know everyone has their own story to tell, but in many ways, I'm most proud of their voices and the ways in which they're part of the story and part of making me who I am today. And so I'm going to do a little bit of reading, and initially, I'm going to start with my great-grandfather, and then I'll talk a little bit. There'll be some interviews and things that my dad talked about, and then some of my own stuff. As I was saying, it was remarkable to discover this book, The White Peril, in Mississippi, because I didn't know much about my dad. I just knew he came to Mississippi and he became Bob Moses. But his mother passed away before we were born. His father died when we were in Tanzania. And so it was almost like he was a myth to me. I didn't understand that, my dad also came from this long narrative, this work across generations to really try to challenge and change the conditions in this country. And so when I discovered my great-grandfather, it was just opening, because now my dad, I could place him in a much larger context and in a much larger history. And so in the book, one of the refrains is this idea of in the distance between us. And so I think about that on a personal level in terms of my relationship with my father and ways in which a lot of distance got created. I don't know if y'all have sons, but I think naturally some distance gets created between fathers and sons. And so the book was an attempt for me to try to close that distance, or try to shorten that distance. But I also think about it in relationship to the distance between white and black America, and what are the things that we need to do to shorten that distance. And then from the perspective of time. So this was written over 100 years ago, and here we are in 2025, confronted with many of the same things that my great-grandfather was confronted with, that Dave and so many others were confronted with in Mississippi. So that's my great-grandfather, some of his kids, his wife, and his sister-in-law. And so William Henry Moses was a farmer, a rail splitter, pastor, evangelist, sensational orator, author of The Life of Christ, a man in a class by himself. And so that's according to Who's Who Among the Colored Baptists. Mr. Moses was reared by Richard Morton, his grandfather, who was the largest and leading landowner of Charlotte County. Being the favorite of his grandfather, he was allowed a liberal use of his extensive library. So my great-grandfather wrote his own obituary, and so I begin the book with that, and this is some of what he had to say about his life. They tell me that I was born December 31st, 1872. I am uncertain about my earthly parents, but I'm reasonably certain of my ultimate creator, who is without beginning of years. As I look back on these 62 years, I rejoice like a strong man having run and won a race. Before I was 10, I was trapping rabbits with bare feet in frosty weather and enjoyed it. My feet became wet in the first rains and snows of autumn, and rain wet them until spring, until I was nearly a man. I was plowing at 10 and cutting wheat at 14, splitting rails and ditching in mud and water up to my waist at 16. At 17, I was hired to oversee a farm of several thousand acres at the highest wages ever paid a colored man in my county. When a student, I worked in the mines of West Virginia to make the money. The first days, my hands became a blister from my wrist to the tips of my fingers, which bursted and dripped blood. But I kept at it, rejoicing with it, until I accomplished my end. I did not pity myself then nor now, but was glad to be alive and too busy to complain. Too busy to complain, yeah. So I was a basketball player in high school, and in college, I thought I was gonna live the dream and go to the NBA. Dave's son is living the dream, so he's an ESPN sports announcer, and so he gets to watch all those games and, hang out with all those players. And hopefully he's making some of that NBA money, I don't know, but. So it didn't work out for me, and I always think of the basketball court as one of the safest places for a black man to grow up in America. And the basketball courts in Cambridge, you would have 3, 4 generations, 5 generations of folks out there on the court playing basketball. And I remember waiting about 10 years, if you can imagine, on the curb to get next, to be able to say I got next and to get in the game. And so when I came to Mississippi, I didn't know who I wanted to be or what I could become. And my dad always made it clear was that he wanted us to be able to work for himself, work for ourselves. And so what that really meant was that he wanted us to be able to work for him. And so all of my early jobs, and I'm not lying, so I was probably in 7th and 8th grade, and I was teaching math to younger kids in summer programs. And so that naturally became what I did. When I was in college, I was teaching math to high school age students and younger kids in the summer. And so other than playing basketball, teaching math was like the only other thing I knew how to do, you know? And so he asked me to come down to Mississippi to work with the Algebra Project. And I said I would. You know, I thought I was going to stay here for a year, kind of lick my wounds and figure out what I was going to do for the rest of my life. But I met folks like Albert, many of the young people in the book, Sammy, Dusty, April, Java, and I found my purpose. So I found my purpose here in Mississippi. And my dad had, you know, on one level, there was this idea that we're gonna come and work with the Algebra Project, but my dad had other ideas about what we were gonna do. And the way I think about it, and I've shared this picture before and talked about just the story, my first experience visiting Mississippi was for Amzie Moore's funeral and how that made an impact on me. But today I'll just talk about what my dad imagined us becoming. And so when I think of Amzie and E.W. Steptoe, you know, these were the elders. These were the Dave Dennises. These were the Mr. Figures. These were my dad when I came down to Mississippi. These were the folks that created some crawl space, created some room for us to begin to do some different kinds of work. And then you have my dad and Julian, who I guess were like me. You know, I was probably in my early 20s. I was leaving college, and I was coming to Mississippi to find myself, to do something about myself. And so the folks that I met, the Curtises and the Hollises, were the Alberts and the Javas and all these young folks. And so in my dad's mind, he saw us as young college people, college-age students, really being catalysts for doing something that was familiar to him, for doing something that he and so many others did when they participated in the movement in Mississippi. But this is what I saw when I first traveled to Mississippi. I continue to count the schools we pass as Tom and I drive behind Spice and Baba. Watkins Elementary is situated on a corner across from the Good Hands Man, a large parking lot where the Good Hands Man washes cars, sells t-shirts and legal insurance, will hawk bootleg CDs and fake Jordans from China as local markets become global. Powell Elementary sits on Livingston Road, past the mobile police station on the corner. The houses here are more modest than the ones we passed on Beasley Road, still suburban looking to me. Fewer cars parked in shorter driveways, the grass less green. Sturdy women walk with their sticks around the school tracks. Children burst from a convoy of school buses. We continue to drive parallel to the railroad tracks. There is a bar at the railroad crossing named the Crossroads. This is also Bully's, a family-owned soul food restaurant just before the Crossroads. Taba, who has been traveling with Baba to Jackson for a year now, will take us there for lunch, and Bully will serve us with a big fat gun on his hip as he guards the cash register and his sisters and his wife, who cook and serve the food, who appear part Pocahontas. Taba can see the head of a freight train coming and says turn, so that We avoid the railroad crossing, which is how Baba ends up behind us. We turn again, drive between the pine-tarred pillars of a small rickety bridge on which train tracks run. It doesn't look capable of holding the freighter. A farmer sits on the corner next to a steel barrel that ejects smoke, has erected a roadside market where he sells fruits and vegetables and coon and possum and muscadines, boiled peanuts and peanut brittle. Coon and possum are written on cardboard, will arrest my eyes every time we drive under the bridge. Eventually we will stop on that patch of dirt, buy muscadines and peanut brittle so that we can lay our eyes on the skinned vermin. We pass a creek where Cookie, as he will tell us, played with all his classmates when they were little, caught frogs and crawfish and moccasins, and then a 9-hole. It is the first time I've seen black people playing golf. And then we turn again past the Christ Missionary and Industrial College with a placard saying it was founded in 1897. It is one of the many examples, like the Rosenwald schools erected across the South, of institutions that were built to move formerly enslaved Africans off the plantation and into society. The street ends and we idle at the corner, face a row of 3 identical shotgun shacks. Each has 2 sets of 3 cement steps, a combined porch, and doors for 2 units. Each apartment is the width of a hallway, with rooms lined up one in front of the other. We turn left on Ridgeway and Baba follows us into the Brinkley Middle School parking lot next to the shacks, which feel like they belong on a plantation. The proximity of the school to these remnants of a plantation illustrates the short distance that Black America has traveled from enslaved Africans. Let's get a move on. We're going to be late, Baba says. It is 100 degrees in the parking lot and 100 more in our Timberland boots. What we have only perceived as history is suddenly perpendicular behind us. We will have the rest of our lives to attempt to reconcile the remarkably short distance we have traveled from America's cotton fields. I found a sermon that my great-grandfather gave. It was published in the Negro World in 1923. And so it talks about the Negro as part of civilization, of 20th century civilization. And that always interested me because the algebra talked about math literacy as the key to citizenship in the 21st century. And so we've been working on becoming part of civilization for a long time. And so this is what my grandfather had to say. There comes a time when the Spirit of God takes the form of protest, and anything besides protest is a mockery of God and a mockery of justice. What are you going to say glory hallelujah for when somebody's beating your boy? This is the spirit of the devil. Somebody has taken your homeland and is dominating the whole earth and is not associating with you and does not want you to associate with yourself, and you stand grinning. Any spirit that makes you submit to that is the spirit of cowardice. We have got to get a new kind of Holy Spirit here, that is, the spirit of protest. There is a spirit of love, there is a spirit of justice, there is a spirit of fair play, the spirit of a fair deal for everybody. There is a spirit of protest. And the man who stands for that, the Spirit of God is upon him, and he has proclaimed the era of opportunity. He will pour out his Spirit upon all flesh. Everybody will see, will find out what is right, what is wrong, and what is truth. And you have never seen so many folks in your life trying to straighten out the world as now. White folks and black folks. All sorts of folks. The world knows this world is not running right. Hardly anything is running right. Talk about great cities like New York, London, and Paris, and men living like devils in hell, can hardly get bread, working from dawn to sunset and cannot get a decent living. That is not right. That's Mr. Figures kind of preacher, huh? Oh, man. One of the gifts was being able to return to my dad's voice. And so I was able to find recorded interviews, that he gave in the early 60s, right after or during the Macomb voter registration effort and other efforts. And so as a child, it was just powerful to be able to hear him and to feel him, particularly after he passed, and to be able to feel his spirit. And so the book has a lot of that interview interwoven throughout the chapters. So this is part of it. We arrived at the courthouse about 10 o'clock. The registrar came out. I waited by the side, waiting for either the farmer or one of the two ladies to say something to the registrar. He asked them what did they want, what were they there for, in a very rough tone of voice. They didn't say anything. They were literally paralyzed with fear. And so after a while, I spoke up and said, they would like to come to register, to try and register to vote. So he asked, well, who are you? What do you have to do with them? Are you here to register? So I told them who I was and that we were conducting a school in Macomb and that these people had attended the school and that they wanted an opportunity to register. Well, he said, they'll have to wait because there was somebody there filling out the form. Well, there was a young white lady there with her husband, and she was sitting down and completing the registration form. When she finished, then our people started to register one at a time. In the meantime, a procession of people began moving in and out of the registration office, the sheriff, a couple of his deputies, people from the office next door, people from the tax office, people who do the driver's license, looking in, staring and moving back out, muttering. A highway patrolman finally came in and sat down in the office, and we stayed that way in sort of uneasy tension all morning. My dad thought that the math lab, which was a room in Brinkley that we created, could be something like a registrar's office. So the science room in Brinkley Middle School looks abandoned. The paint on the walls is chipped, cracked beakers collect dust on large blacktop tables. It reeks of a forgotten, unloved place. The air is damp, contaminated with chemicals whose shelf life has expired. The room is attached to the end of the hallway at the edge of the school building, an unused appendage. In this way, it's perfect, a space in the building that needs redeeming, that Baba can redefine, that the algebra project that Kari and Tab and I and the students can reclaim as our own. Baba calls it the math lab, crawl space, he says. I understand it as a little wiggle room in the building for us to do what we need to do. Baba thinks about it more broadly in relationship to the 1957 Civil Rights Act. It is a space created in the larger political and social world that we can use to our advantage. In relationship to math, he thinks about crawl space in this way. Nations and institutions are now making a global transition from reliance upon technology that primarily organizes physical labor to technologies that directly organize mental labor. I see history's broom sweeping us all along a common corridor. As organizers, we can make use of that corridor as crawl space towards liberation. They first charged me with interfering with an officer in the process of arresting somebody, and then found out that the only person arrested was myself. And they changed the charge to interfering with an officer in the discharge of his duties. The county attorney asked if I was ready for the trial. I said, could I make a phone call? He said yes, so I picked up the phone and called Washington, D.C., the Justice Department, because I had been in communication with some members of the Justice Department, particularly John Doerr, and I'd received letters delineating those sections of the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and 1960, which guaranteed protection to people who are trying to register and to anyone who's aiding other people in trying to register. And he had also indicated that if we had any trouble, we were to call Washington or the nearest office of the FBI, So I called him collect. The people in the office were rather astonished at that, at the fact that the call went through, and then they began to get fidgety. And I'm gonna need your help for this second to last part. I'll tell you when I need you. All right. We the people. And so my dad was extremely invested in this idea of we the people. I don't know, I think black folks are extremely invested in democracy and in America working as a democratic, inclusive, participatory democracy. So Maisha, who's my sister, will say repeatedly that we're in Baba's world now. Brinkley Middle School, the Algebra Project classrooms, and now us in the math lab, all part of a constellation of characters, places, and ideas that Baba imagined could be networked to take advantage of the crawl space this country afforded. In Baba's world, a student could be a sharecropper, a principal, a plantation owner, a teacher, an overseer, students in a corridor, a current in an ocean of movement. Sammy and Dusty could become Curtis and Hollis, and Brenda Travis, and the many others who'd organized with him in the 60s, made demands on themselves and each other for change. The classroom could be a vessel, a jail cell, a school building, a slave ship, young people, prisoners, a principal, a warden, a postulate, a North Star, mathematics, a trail to freedom, the rails on the Underground Railroad, a farm, a freedom school, young people, insurgents. There's nothing stopping us from inducting ourselves into the We the People class, Baba would say. We are among the we in the We the People of the United States of America. The math lab, a registrar's office, a teacher, a naturalization officer, the preamble to the Constitution, a green card. Let us enact an induction for ourselves, he would say, and then we repeat it after him. Y'all ready? This was his thing before he passed. I remember they brought him up to Michigan to do a commencement. And he got up and just did this and sat down, and so we're gonna do it. So y'all get to repeat after me. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It doesn't say we the citizens, we the whites, we the landowners, we the men, he said. What you need to do is claim it for yourself. The last thing we'll do before Mr. Figures and Albert come up, so I've been thinking about, I have two kids, a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old, and so what do they need to do to claim the Constitution for themselves, particularly in these times? And what are some of the ways I can introduce them to the people and the work that's been done, which really sets a precedent for what we need to do and what we need to remember to make it through some of the times that we're dealing with now and what we're soon to be facing. And so I created a video that includes my daughter. I'm going to play it, and then we'll talk a little bit and answer some questions. All right. The Wild was a strip of woods on the other side of the Charles River. We were approaching the 80s, still missing teeth, when Tob and I began crossing the water alone. We rode our bikes over the walking bridge where the juvenile delinquent slept on days like this, hell-bent on shattering whatever serenity remained in the water. We rode along the opposite bank, through goose shit quilted grass. I thought of the water as perilous, not life-giving, life-taking. It had been fertile once, when the Massachusetts migrated from their winter villages to forage and hunt and fish, before the marshes were filled with dirt and paved, before the factories, before the Massachusetts were removed from the wild and remembered on the state seal, bow and arrow pointed down, signifying the authority of the state now bearing their name.
75 miles an hour.
I yelled. Engines, slivers of cardboard. We were abandoning civilization, moving beyond our parents, society's gaze. The wild was a canopy of trees, more dank and dark. We became still in its shade. I felt the urge to leave my scent on bark. Trees became audible as we filled our lungs. There was fresh blood on our shins from the bramble. Our bodies were thirsty. In the wild, we could be Africans. In the wild, we saw a colored white man who grew as tall as the tall grass with the buttercups and black-eyed Susans, as if he had abandoned civilization to become indigenous.
100 miles an hour.
Taba yelled. We rode past the Harvard Stadium, built like an ancient Roman arena, past the Blodgett Pool, where Mama and Baba sent us for basic training. Maisha was the first to integrate, shatter the lie on the surface of the water. Coach Bernal taught us how to envision ourselves swimming like dolphins. In the imagining and reimagining, we learned to rise above the cage of expectations, circumscribing black and white life in America. Don't shit in our toilets. Don't use all our hot water. Harvard students and faculty said. Baba offered his gurus.
How does he do that?
Our teammates asked. He is meditating, we said. In the dead of winter, the surface of the Charles River became ice covered in tracks. Mama said if the ice were to break, there were currents beneath the surface strong enough to drag us to the ocean, return us to our Creator. After practice, the Blodgett parking lot became a maze of headlights, bleached blonde moms, chlorine-soaked kids huddled like penguins. Baba arrived in an Impala. It was primitive. What did you say? Baba said to the cop, detonating a decade of quiet. Maisha reached for Baba's arm, returned him to us. It was the first time we saw his anger, pen up, from his perilous journey through the wilds of white America. What we felt at times in his quiet, in the tone of his voice, in a glare, the undercurrents of rage his gurus helped to contain, prevented him from drowning in, now spilling into the parking lot, flooding the Impala. I thought of the water as perilous, not life-giving, life-taking. Thank you. So I think I'm supposed to introduce Albert and Mr. Figures, but they don't need any introduction. Y'all already know they are. Yeah. So I'm gonna pass it to Mr. Figures, our elder, to get it started.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I want to urge everyone to get a copy of this book. The reason is, a few weeks ago, after the Super Bowl, Kendrick it was a lot of buzz that Monday morning. And the buzz was because Kendrick Lamar did a theatrical performance for about 13 minutes. And 130 some million people watched it. More people watched his performance than watched the whole Super Bowl. But the thing about it, I didn't see it and I didn't understand it. So I asked my daughter to explain to me what was happening. And she explained it to me like it was a coded message of some sort. And I was asking so many questions. She said, "Oh, Daddy, don't worry about it. It wasn't for you." So I took it like that. But I know and understand in the history of our people that we've had coded messages, whether it was with drums on the continent of Africa or wasn't allowed to use in this country, whether it was embedded in our music or whatever. But folk, it's a coded message in this book. It's 3 generations, 4 generations really, of voices through our struggle. And the preacher has, his great-grandfather has a sermon that he's preaching in the early 1920s about Marcus Garvey and helping Marcus Garvey. And he takes it from the 12th chapter of the First Chronicles, I think. And embedded in there is people who understand the times. And the times in the 20s for us in this country were the bombing in Tulsa, the bombing in Rosewood, the massacre in Elaine, the massacre in LaFleur County, Mississippi. All of that was going on, and in addition to that, the very convention, the Baptist convention that he was General Secretary of, W.H. Moses was General Secretary, it was kind of unraveling, if you will. The Church of God in Christ had come out of it. The Church Christ Holiness USA had come out of it. In fact, another Baptist convention had come out of it. The National Baptist Convention of America had come out of it. And he was struggling, trying to hold everything together, asking and preaching for people who understood the times and what people ought to do. And then in his will, which is in here, his last will, he says in 1940 that I've spent my life trying to get people to understand the true gospel of Jesus Christ and what it means. And I could have had a lot of money, but instead I did this and I traveled around, I met people, and I provided my children with an education. That's the second generation. And then enter his father, who comes to Mississippi per the insistence of Ella Baker. And she introduces him to the infrastructure in Mississippi, Amzie Moore down in Hattiesburg, Vernon Damer and C.C. Bryant and E.W. Steptoe. And then after what you might say the climax of our movement during that time, the military police industrial complex attacks and forces people underground and forces people out of the country. And as a result, this young man is born in Tanzania, is where Dr. Moses lands. And then, almost by providence, his father ends back up in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, and other places about the state. And then Providence so arranges this young man to come and join his father. And out of that initiative comes Albert and a whole generation of other young people, Miss Simmons, a whole generation of other people who have taken on the mantle of this struggle of ours. And they are positioned in various places about the country now, impacting other young people. Look, it's a coded message in here. Get it and unravel it. You'll see it. You'll see it.
That was a hard setup, Mr. Figures. So first I want to say that for me and the young folks who came up in the Algebra Project, when Bob released his book, Radical Equations, I adopted that as my Bible. So I know more about movement and organizing from the stories that Bob was sharing inside of that book and the strategies and the relationships. And one of the things that I really appreciated about it was that it told the story of regular, everyday Mississippians who were the real engine behind the movement for freedom in Mississippi, and made me understand how important it is that we knock on doors and that we access the relationships that we have at churches, and that we accept the gifts that people bring as they bring them. And so I did an interview on this platform called StoryCorps with my son, who was 9 years old at the time. And at the end of the interview, me and my son just locked in a room talking, right? So at the end of the interview, my son says, "What is your dream for me? Like, what do you want for me in my life?" And I introduced my son to a proverb that talks about babies are born with their fists closed because that's where they hold all of their gifts. And over time, babies learn to release their hands, to unfold their hands so that they can release their gifts. And so for me, the Algebra Project was a place that let me release my gifts. And so I remember trying to influence my kids, because Bob always had this mandate that young people need to figure it out. So it didn't matter how good we thought we were doing. It didn't matter how much we thought we had bought into the program, the thinking, the ways, the concepts. Bob would always say, young people got to figure it out. So much that he put pressure on them to figure it out. And then O became a person close enough in age of us to immediately say to us, man, we got to figure it out, right? And so the experiences in this book come across many generations. And it's the same with the work of the Algebra Project in the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Freedom Struggle. That I'm lucky enough that Hollis Watkins died at almost 80 years old, and me and him can say we shared the same mentor, Bob Moses, right? But then to go through this and hear how Omo's great-grandfather talks about God and the energy of God in protest. And as soon as I read the words, but then hearing Omo say it again today, first person I think about is Mr. Figures, a man who really wraps himself up in the energy of God in the form of protest. And he's a mentor of mine. I've been around Mr. Figures my whole life, and I've been fortunate enough that, again, me and him can say we had the same mentor, but then I can also say I was fortunate enough to always be mentored by him and folks like Hollis. And so just as much as the book is a generational story, the work is too. And so I hope that in some instances, for somebody, that the same way Radical Equations became my Bible, that for some young people this becomes the Bible of their time. Shortly before we got here, Omo and myself were at the correctional facility this morning. And leaving there, Omo said something that we should really, really think about. So we in there with his book with these young men that's locked up. And we get in the car to leave, and Omo said, man, you know, I could take my book into prison, but you can't get this type of information in the school, right? This anti-CRT thing says that kids in school shouldn't be able to learn this, right? And then in prison, they let you bring it in there because they want to keep them busy with these not kids that they believe in. And so it's important that when we do have those types of works inside our facilities, that we also have examples that young people can see that this came from this man and from his experience and from his father's and his great-grandfather's experience, but through that book is so many other people's lives and stories. And so I think of that as our baby. And thank you, Omar.
Well, we're going to open it up. I'd love Dave. You can have my seat if you want to come up here, or if you want to ask any questions or share anything to get us started.
I don't have much to say. I mean, you've said it all, just about is, and just being here. It's one of the children of the movement and of my best friend, son. So, as Bob would say, I mean, to young people, y'all got it now, man. You know, so just keep on pushing, and your show. Love you, man.
Love you. Thanks. Well, we'd love to open it up for any questions. Yeah. Hey, when we asked the young people yesterday if they had questions, I would say 100 out of 120 young people raised their hands and they had something to say. So I hope y'all have some questions.
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I was just wondering, and correct me if I'm wrong, your dad, Bob,
Yeah.
if I can call him that,
Yeah.
he was doing quite well in New York, teaching,
Yeah.
had a good job. I just want, why he chose to come to Mississippi, where there's a massive struggle and it involves all kinds of difficulties. Why did he leave where he was comfortable, got a job, got a position, and doing quite well, successful? He chose to leave to come to Mississippi. I'm just wondering why he did that.
Yeah.
Why he
That's a
chose to
great question.
come and get involved in the struggle
Yeah.
when he could stay in New York and be comfortable.
I don't know how comfortable he would have been in New York, but my dad talks about going from Stuyvesant, you know, so he grew up in Harlem River houses, and he tested into Stuyvesant, and so that's an elite school. His classmate was Al Poussaint, who just passed away on Monday, and was also a friend and a supporter of the work. And so they were the only two probably black folks at Stuyvesant, and then he went from Stuyvesant to Hamilton, so he's probably the only black person. And then he and Uncle Al ended up at Harvard at the same time. And so he describes that experience of just moving through these elite white institutions and how in many ways that was damaging to him. And so there were some benefits, but in many ways that were damaging. And so when he saw the folks sitting in North Carolina on the cover of the New York Times, he talked about those young people looked and felt the same way that he looked and felt, but they were doing something about it. And so, you know, he had resources. Some of the reason he ended up in Mississippi was due to his mother passed away, and then his father lost it and was hospitalized, and so that freed him up to an extent. But then he went to visit his Uncle Bill, who was an architect at Hampton University, and he participated in his first protest there, and he talked about just being unleashed. Like that was the first time he ever confronted what he's always been confronted with. And then that led to him connecting with Bayard Rustin, which to me is amazing. If I'm like, all right, I want to get involved in the movement, I'm going to go talk to Obama. Obama's going to send me to, you know, some other person, and now I'm in the game. But he went from Bayard Rustin to Martin Luther King at SCLC, where he met Ella, and Ella put him on a bus to Mississippi. And it was on that bus where he met Amzie Moore, C.C. Bryant, and so many others. And he said Amzie had the plan for what to do in Mississippi. Yeah, so that's how we ended up in Mississippi.
I'm over here. First and foremost, I want to thank you for doing this History's Lunch program. This has been incredible. And I also want to thank you for spending time with our students on yesterday. I was not there, but my understanding is that they were really captivated during the program. And I had two questions. I was wondering what the takeaway was from you spending time with our students yesterday. And then just what has kind of stuck out with you as you've been doing this book tour?
Yeah.
What are some key moments for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so after the election, I unplugged, I stopped watching any of the news, and it's just felt painful, and it's been hard to describe. And I know all of you, many of you have felt that similar kind of pain. And every day it seems like, you know, it can be worse. And so that can be paralyzing, you know, and it's like my mother, when I tell my mother I'm going to Mississippi, she's like, you know, she says a prayer for me, you know, my mother. But when I get to Mississippi, I'm like, man, there's no other place I'd rather be. It's just great to be here. And so what I've learned has been getting out, seeing this room, all the people that are in this space, is exactly what needs to happen to, it's exactly what folks in power don't want to see happen. And so it's just been remarkable being in spaces with so many different people, being able to have conversations. I mean, I think there's some challenging things that are in the book that get raised. And, you know, right before I came here, I did a presentation at Medford City Hall, which is outside of Cambridge, and about half of and it was at the mayor's office, so it was all the city employees, and about half of them were firemen. And so you know what that looks like. And it was, you know, they were looking at me like, I can't believe he said that, or he's about to say that, or he showed that, you know. But I think at the end of it, it forced them to try to wrestle with some truth, you know. And so I think that's part of what we have to do. And yesterday was really amazing. I mean, it gave me hope, you know, to see all those young people. There was a group, I forget what school they were from, that was predominantly white. You know, it was like us on the swim team, and there was one black kid, and, you know, it was all white folks. And so, but then, you know, there are all these other groups of folks, and everyone had something to say and wanted to say something. And if we had set it up a little bit differently, there would have been a lot of interaction and conversation across the grades and across, you know, the different groups. And I'll forget, I punted at the end of the conversation. So we talked about what does peril mean, and they had different ideas. And so, you know, it was up on there. The White Peril was the title, and, you know, I think that's provocative to a certain extent. And so people talked about peril. And then at the end, it was one of the young white students, and he asked, he was like, so why did you name this book again, The White Peril? And to me, it was like, he went through all this stuff, he was processing stuff, he was thinking about it, and now he wanted to try to better understand what this meant in relationship to what he just experienced in him. And so I took the easy way out. I just said, well, my great-grandfather wrote a book called The White Peril because it was at the end, but it felt like that was another opportunity to go a little bit deeper and to have a conversation. And so that's what I'm hopeful for. I mean, I feel like there's a precedent that folks have, you know, come out of Reconstruction. We've come through the Civil Rights Movement. We've been able to do a lot of things. And I think there are things that we can go back to and learn from that can help us build different types of communities that can hopefully do something about what's coming and what's here. Yeah.
Couple questions. One is, okay, I understand this spirituality from your grandfather as far as his connection with Jesus Christ. Okay, I think your father was such an amazing person. And one first question is, did he have the same type of connection with Christianity and Jesus as his grandfather? The second question is, my understanding is when he first got to Mississippi, went down near Pike County, Macomb, right? That was not an amazing place for black people at that time. Why did he choose Macomb when Delta and so many other places that we were struggling and poor as poor can be?
Yeah. So I would say my dad had the same relationship with our Creator, whatever you call that. I mean, he didn't study the Bible. I think the first time I went to church was in Mississippi, probably with Mr. Figures. But, you know, it's funny, when he went to Tanzania, someone saw him walking me when they couldn't put me to sleep when I was young, and I would always cry at night, and so he'd, you know, spend hours just walking with me on the road until I fell asleep. And someone gave him a book called The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, and they said, you're going to need what's in this book to raise this boy. And so that became his practice. Self-realization, he would meditate a lot, and he passed that on particularly to my sisters, who also practiced that. But you know, I think my dad got stuck in the movement, you know. I think on some level, you can imagine him going off to India and meditating and just kind of removing himself from society. But on another level, he never left Mississippi, and he was always thinking about what could he do, you know, to his last days. You know, he said, I want to die with my boots on. He wanted to do things to try to impact democracy in America. And so I think he struggled with that, his own spiritual calling and the work that he felt he needed to do in America.
All right, we've got time for one more question if there's one not out there. Uma, will you tell us a little bit? We've got on the screen the Bob Moses Fund and the SNCC Legacy Project toolkits. Do you mind just telling us a little bit about both of those before we wrap today?
Yep. So the fund was something we created in honor of my dad, and we've funded organizations and local leaders that we think of as carrying on in the spirit of my dad and his work. We're also beginning to try to use that just as a location to provide stories and experiences of people that interact with the book and some other stuff. But I think the real site is the SNCC Legacy Project toolkits. And so if you scan that, I think it gives you access to a lot of the folks that you're familiar with that participated in the movement. And it provides just different things that can be shared with young people that can be a resource for them, thinking about what they want, or inspire them to do something about some of the things that they're challenged with.
Absolutely, thank you. And if you guys didn't get to attend, we had there was a toolkit workshop at Tougaloo earlier this month, and there will be another one here at the two Mississippi Museums on April 26th. And so there's still time to register for that. So if you have questions about it, you can see our MDH events page for that information. Before we give them a round of applause, I want to encourage you to come back next week. Next week we will be remembering Mr. Elbert Hilliard, a longtime director here at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, as we get to honor him for History's Lunch next week. So we hope that you'll come back and join us. But one more time, let's give Uma Moses, Albert Sykes, and Mr. Frank Figures a round of applause. For those of you that would like to purchase